Welcome to the preaching ministry of First Cumberland Presbyterian Church of Chattanooga. This recording is simply the sermon portion of our worship service. To experience our full worship service, we encourage you and invite you to join us Sunday morning at 11 in our beautiful sanctuary located at 1505 North Moore Road.
All week long, we have been in the Day Player Summer Camp working with the story of Moses. And so we have been thinking about and talking about and even celebrating the story of Moses and the people's delivery out of slavery from Egypt. If you have been watching the Sunday school lessons that I've been recording on and putting out on Saturdays, you know that we are also working with the book of Psalms. And so I guess I've just had Moses and the Psalms in my mind all kind of jumbled up. The 77th Psalm says that God leads the people through the ocean, and yet it is as if God's footsteps are footprints in the ocean. And one translation says that God is hidden in the hands of Moses and Aaron. And in so many ways, God indeed is in our lives in ways that we may not even recognize, hidden in the hands of others, even as we are led through mighty oceans. And then the 40th Psalm, although was written long after the time of Moses, as were all of the Psalms, certainly is a psalm that Moses could have sung or prayed, and it sounds to me much like the experience that Moses and the people had in the wilderness. And so let me share with you, if you will, the first 10 verses of the 40th Psalm. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the desolate pit, out of the miry bog, and set my feet on a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Happy are those who make the Lord their trust, who do not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after false gods. You have multiplied, O Lord my God, your wondrous deeds and your thoughts toward us. None can compare with you. Were I to try to proclaim and tell of them, they would be more than can be counted. Sacrifice and offering you do not desire, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Then I said, here I am in the scroll of the book as it is written of me. I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart. I have told the glad news of deliverance in the great congregation. See, I have not restrained my lips. As you know, O Lord, I have not hidden your saving help within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I have not concealed your steadfast love and your faithfulness from the great congregation. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. When we think of Moses, we think of several things, of course. The burning bush, the parting of the sea, the 10 commandments, and the 40 long years in the wilderness. And all of those are worthy of psalms, worthy of prayers. All of those events were bathed in the prayers of Moses. They're testimonies to God, how God acted as a shepherd, bringing the people through both storms and wilderness. And they are also reminders that God works in our lives. It may take a long time, but God is taking us somewhere, and God is with us, sometimes seen and sometimes unseen. Some time ago, I read a book called A Short Walk to the Edge of Life by Scott Hubbard. And Scott was a man who married a woman who was Peruvian. And after he'd been married for a number of years, and she had told him many times of how her father would walk from one city to another through the Andes desert, he decided that he wanted to try to duplicate that walk that her father often made. And so he went to Peru and went to the city that he was going to begin in and began making his way through the Peruvian desert. And he really thought that it was going to just be a day hike. That's what it always was for his wife's father. And so he really didn't plan accordingly. He said he was wearing tennis shoes when he should have been wearing much, much sturdier boots. He only took a limited amount of water and food and no shelter or no plans for spending the night in the cold desert night, and no real plans for a lot of comfort during the hot desert days. And long story short, he got nearly hopelessly lost in the trackless Andean desert. It was a terrifying time for him. He was cut up and bruised from falls and from cacti. His shoes basically were falling apart. He was parched, and he ended up spending days and days and days in the wilderness. The whole book is written about the ways that God helped him in the wilderness. And he says that he prayed to God for help, and yet God's help never came in one big miracle. A helicopter didn't appear overhead, or some traveler through the wilderness didn't find him and lead him to safety. And yet God gave him the steps. God gave him the wisdom, and God directed him even in ways he wasn't aware. Toward the end of this long trek, late one day, as the sun was about to go down, he suddenly stepped from the wilderness onto a dirt road. And he was so excited, he was thinking about following that road through the night until he could find a village or find some kind of help. But he said something told him, and he recognized, at least later, that it had to be the voice of God. Wait, spend one more night in the wilderness, and then make your way down the road. He obeyed that voice, and the next day as he began making his way down the road, he noticed that it branched off many times, and one branch would go into the wilderness, and one branch would apparently continue towards civilization, and the only way to tell was to follow the branch that had the and tire tracks. And he said had he tried to follow that road at night, he wouldn't have been able to see those tire tracks, and he almost certainly would have remained lost. But it was following those tire tracks that ultimately got him to safety, and was able to become just another victim of the Andean desert, but it made him instead be able to write this wonderful book about the way that God offers to us, maybe not always a miracle in one fell swoop, but miracles in little bits and pieces, just enough mercy for the next day. That was certainly the experience of Moses. It's the experience of the psalmist, the experience of many of us. Back in 2006, I had my own experience in the wilderness, in the desert. I convinced my father-in-law, Lee's father, both of her brothers, and 2 other friends to go with me on a 5-day, 6-night backpacking trip in the Grand Canyon. And we flew to Phoenix. We drove all the way through the night to get to the canyon, and we began our trip about 6 o'clock in the morning so that we could hike in the cool morning hours. Our first day's trip was supposed to be just 6 miles, and it was all downhill because we were going down into the canyon. And so we decided we will be at our campsite by lunch. And the campsite was supposed to be next to a little creek that even had a swimming hole. And so we were just so excited about this easy day's hike that we broke rule number 1 in the Grand Canyon. Do not separate from the group. Everybody should stay together. But it's only 6 miles, and it'll only be maybe 6 hours at the most. 1 mile an hour is slow for hiking. So we separated, the faster ones of us ahead, the slower ones behind. Most of us made it to the camp not by noon, but by 3. It was so much hotter, so much of a harder hike than we possibly could have imagined. Those of us that were there were sure that the remaining stragglers would be there any minute. The last 2 to come into camp were Lee's father and one of our friends and they were the 2 oldest members of our expedition. And now I just feel so awful about the fact that we just kind of ran off and left them. Lee's father was having certainly some dehydration and probably heat exhaustion. We spent the night there in that place. The next morning, we only had to go another mile or so down to the Colorado River, and so we did that. Although Lee's father was moving very slowly, we did all stay together that day. By the third and the fourth day, it was obvious Lee's father was in pretty bad shape. He was just not bouncing back like you might expect someone to bounce back, perhaps due to his age, perhaps due to the fact that it had been such a difficult first day, and it had maybe just taken all out of him that it could. And we were very, very worried literally that he might not survive this hike, as we are in the desert and the temperatures are soaring to well over 115, sometimes even maybe 120 each day. I will never forget standing in this dry wash with Lee's older brother Danny, and Danny weeping, saying, I don't know what to do, but I can't go home and explain to our mother how I let our father die out here in the desert. We all kind of got together and decided that we needed to pray. Now, I was pretty clear or actually more unclear, I suppose, about what are we supposed to pray for. It was pretty clear to me that we couldn't pray that God would change the entire weather pattern of the desert Southwest just for us. We knew what we were doing. We knew that we were going into the desert in a time when it was going to be hot. We had broken that very important rule, and that was still hurting us days later. And it just didn't seem fair to say, well, God, would you drop the temperature 40 or 50 degrees for us? But we did know that we had to pray, and we needed to pray. And Mark, Lee's middle brother, prayed, and he prayed the most beautiful prayer. And what he prayed for was wisdom. Help us know, God, what we need to do to be able to safely make it out of the desert. And I don't know if it was from that moment on, probably not. I think God had been guiding us before, but from that moment on, we certainly were guided by God. And we began talking and making a plan. And we decided that we could send somebody up ahead to make a mad dash to try to find a ranger and have them send in a helicopter and have Bobby transported out. But we also talked about if he were taken to a hospital, what the hospital would do would be they would keep him cool, and they would push fluids on him, and they would make him rest. And although it was going to be hard for us to keep him completely cool, we weren't going to have air conditioning, we had all of the other ingredients we needed. We could give him the rest he needed by just leaving him in place and staying with him for 24 or more hours. We could push fluids on him. We could set up a tarp and make sure that he was always in the shade. And so we decided that was what we were going to do. He didn't want us to call for a helicopter. He wanted to try to get out on his own power. He felt like he could, and so that's what we did. We called that place Hospital Rock, and I'll never forget it. The second part of the plan we made was that Richard, one of the other friends, and I would make our way to where the next campsite was supposed to be. And we would camp there that night and then come back early the next morning so that we could carry Bobby and Rick's packs, because they both were suffering. Rick was suffering a little bit as well. And that way they could walk without having to carry one of those heavy packs. And so Richard and I went to the campsite. We spent the night there, got out early, like 2 in the morning, and began making our way back across to Hospital Rock. And as we're making our way back across to Hospital Rock, I just knew at that moment that this was going to work, that all of the trauma that we had experienced was now dissipating. We had a good plan. God had guided us, and we were going to have everything we needed to be able to get ourselves out of that desert. That remains my favorite hike I've ever taken in my entire life. It was such a wonderful, wonderful hike in the cool early morning as the sun began to come up. We got to Hospital Rock. Everybody got assembled, and we made it back, and we were able to make it to within maybe a mile or so of the rim. Spent one more night in the canyon, and then the next morning we're able to hike out. And that last night was a night of great celebration. Bobby was feeling much better. We knew we'd be getting out the next day, and we knew that God indeed had delivered us. That whole story to me can be summed up almost in the words of the 40th Psalm. God drew me up from the desolate pit, out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Standing there weeping with Danny in that wash was that desolate pit. Hiking back across to pick up the team and to get them out was God putting our feet on a rock and putting a new song in our mouths. Psalm 40 continues, happy are those who make the Lord their trust, who do not turn to the proud, those who go astray after false gods. And of course, the story of Moses and the people in the wilderness was a constant story about them being tempted and often succumbing to the temptation to put their trust in false gods, but then being able to return again to the Lord. One of the false gods that I think we put our trust in often is the God of immediate gratification. When we pray to God, we want to say to God, this is what I want done, and this is how I want you to do it, and I want you to do it now. And yet this psalm so beautifully and wisely begins, I waited patiently for the Lord. Now, waiting patiently doesn't mean just sitting back and being passive. It is crying out to the Lord, perhaps, but putting our trust in the Lord, as the psalm says, looking for the ways. Perhaps that God isn't providing one massive miracle to make everything all right, but providing just enough mercy to get through the day, providing the wisdom to know what is the next step to take, what is the plan. This story is our story, is it not? The story of Moses and his people, the story of the man in the Andean desert, the story of our hiking trip, but it's also the story of our lives. So many ways, I know all of us have had times when we were literally or figuratively in a pit or felt like we were in a miry bog and couldn't get out. And then either all at once or step by step, God led us out until our feet were on a rock. And yet the story of Moses and the people of God and our story is not just about what has God done for me, but about how do I take what God has done for me and use it as a testimony for others. The psalm continues saying in the 9th and 10th verses, I've told the glad news of deliverance. See, I've not restrained my lips. I've not hidden your saving help within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. I've not concealed your steadfast love and your faithfulness. God has us on a mission. Not a mission just to get to the promised land, not a mission just to make it to heaven. Our mission is to proclaim to the Lord our testimony. I think one of the disservices the church has done to people over the last 50 or 60 years is said that your testimony is something you memorize, that someone else wrote perhaps for you, the 4 spiritual laws, or a list of questions that are kind of manipulative that you can use to try to draw someone into a spiritual conversation. Instead, the psalm simply says, tell of what God has done for you. Be honest about both the struggles and the triumphs that you have had with God, and that will draw people to you. Rather than some written speech that somebody else wrote, we can be like John Newton, who in his hymn simply tells his story. I once was blind, but now I see. Was lost, but now I'm found. And through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will bring me home. I didn't go past the 10th verse in the 40th Psalm, and yet you should know that the end of the Psalm is almost a mirror image of the beginning. The beginning tells of a time when the psalmist was in trouble and cried out to God, and God saved him. The end, the last verses, are the mirror image of that. It is the psalmist finds himself again in that difficult place and is crying out, waiting for the help that has not yet come. And I find that so wise and so wonderful, because we know that all of us are going to be in the desert, in the miry bog from time to time. Since 2006, I have literally and figuratively been in the desert since, and I've had to cry out to God, and God has rescued me. Life is a constant journey, and the psalmist recognizes that. It's not that God takes us out to some place and that's the end of the story, but our story is always being on a journey, but always that journey is a journey with God. And so the psalm ends, you are my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, O my God. And God indeed is our help and deliverer. Even when we are impatient or we are blinded to God's presence, God is with us. God is leading us. God is giving us those tender daily mercies that we need. And we are promised that God does not delay, because God is right with us. And even if the end of the story is delayed, God's part in our story is never delayed, but is always with us, because God is always with us. And thanks be to God for these promises, for these stories of Moses and of us. Let us be wonderful witnesses of those things that God has done for us today, tomorrow, and always. Amen.
Thank you for joining us for this message from the preaching ministry of First Cumberland Presbyterian Church. Once more, we hope you'll join us in person Sunday at 11 a.m. for worship.